I'm Tamara, and today we are going to be making 4 different drawstring bags. So this tutorial may look a little long, but it's 4 tutorials in one. So if there is a particular bag that you want to make, check out the description down below because I am going to have timestamps down there that will bring you to each of these drawstring bags, so you don't have to watch all 4 tutorials if you don't want to. I will also have links down there, anything that I've used in this tutorial if you're interested. The fabric that I'm using is all by Michael Miller Fabric if you're interested in that. Now let me tell you the differences between all 4 so you know which tutorial you want to make. So this is bag number 1. Now this particular bag has no lining. It's the only one of all 4 that is made without a lining. It has a nice hook on the back so you can actually hang your bag up without using the ropes. It's tied a little bit differently, and it is just a super fun and easy tutorial. This is beginner friendly. The first 2 bags are actually beginner friendly, and then the last 2 bags are a little bit more beginner intermediate. I still think a beginner can do it. All you have to do is sew slow and go step by step, and I know that you can do this. Bag number 2 is this bag here. Now this particular bag is made only cutting 2 different pieces of fabric, but we are turning that into our lining and our casing. So because of that, this particular tutorial is best made using non-directional fabric. So as you can see, like the print is kind of all over instead of bag number 1, where my print was definitely directional. All right, now bag number 3, if I had a favorite, and I do, it's this one. This is my favorite drawstring bag, and I think partially because it's the girliest of the 3, and it's this bag here. And I think I'm partial to girly projects because I have 2 boys, so I tend to sew with boy fabric more than girl fabric, but I love this bag. This particular bag, you actually make your own fabric rope. So if you want to do that for any of the tutorials, just check out how I did that in tutorial number 3. We also have 2 different fabrics. It's still lined, and we've added a lace detail on top. The lace is optional because your casing is sewn within the bag itself, and because of that, you already have something above the casing that will naturally ruffle when you pull it together. And now on to bag number 4, which is this bag here. It also does not look too difficult. It has a lining, but the difference here is you're actually using 3 different fabrics, 1 for the casing, 1 for the lining, and then 1 for the outer fabric. Now this one also has a nice hook on it, and we add the hook a little bit differently than we do bag number 1. It also has a pocket on the inside, so you can check out the tutorial for that. And this bag also has a boxed bottom, which I just think is an adorable added little extra. So how do you make your drawstring bags? Do you add ribbon? Do you add grommets? Leave those in the comments down below so that others, when they want to make their drawstring bags, can check out your suggestions as well, and we can all make some fun drawstring bags for those that we love. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell if you don't want to miss me on YouTube, and I hope that you guys have an enjoyable time sewing. To make this drawstring bag without a lining, you will need to cut out 2 pieces of fabric. You will cut them out at 18 inches tall by 15 inches wide. Then you'll want to take it to your sewing machine and sew a zigzag stitch along the outer edges. Or if you have a pair of pinking shears, you can snip around the outer edges with a pair of pinking shears. The reason why we're doing this is because there is no lining, so these edges are going to fray a lot more unless you do this step. Next, we will cut out 1 piece of fabric measuring at 2 inches by 6 inches, and that will be our loop. And then you will need 2 more pieces of fabric cut out at 2 inches by 3 inches, and those will be our 2 bottom tabs that we will be able to pull our rope through later on. To prepare these 3 pieces of fabric, just take it to your iron and press them in half. Then take those outer edges and press those inwards, finally folding it in half and clipping along that outer edge. You can then take it to your sewing machine and sew along both long edges. I also recommend that you backstitch when you start and you stop. Next, take the 2 main pieces of fabric, lay them right sides together, and then mark along both top edges 2 inches down and draw a line, and then 3 inches down and draw another line. Next, we want to place our tabs in between our 2 pieces of fabric. Just fold them in half so that their raw ends will be facing towards the raw edges of our fabric, and tuck them in about 1 inch up on both sides. Then clip them in place. And now it's time to take it to your sewing machine, and we will be sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you will start from the top edge, do a backspace, and sew to that 2-inch mark and do another backspace. Then skip over that 1-inch section, start again with a back stitch, and go all the way to that bottom corner, going across the bottom and back up to that marking that we made, finishing that up with the back stitch, and then skipping over that 1-inch section, doing another back stitch and sewing up to the top. Then just trim away both of the bottom corners, making sure not to get too close to the actual seam that you've just sewn. If you have a pair of pinking shears, I highly recommend using them when you cut away those 2 corners. Now, this next step is optional. However, I do this step on every single one of my drawstring bags, and that's because as you're creating your loop, by doing this extra little step, you are stopping the fabric that is folded in your loop with the drawstrings within it from getting pulled out of that hole. So just press those seams open, and you can see right here we have that little opening that we left for our drawstrings. Grab something to measure 5 inches down. I like using this measuring gauge for these smaller measurements, and draw a 5-inch mark at the bottom. You'll do this on both seams. Then take this to your sewing machine, start with a back stitch, go all the way down to that marked line, sew across, and then sew back up to the top, ending with a back stitch. You'll do this on both seams. By doing this, you're tacking those flaps down so that they won't get pulled out when the drawstring is through the hole. Next, it's time to create our casing. So grab your iron and press that top edge in about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in. Just make sure it's all the same. Then you'll fold it down one more time at around 1 3/4 inches, making sure that that hole that we left there on both sides is not being covered up or sewn over. Once you have everything pressed nicely, you can pin all the way around, and then you'll sew 2 seams, one along that bottom edge and one along the top edge. You will do a back stitch when you start and when you stop for both seams. Now it's time to turn our project right side out and add our rope. Now you can use ribbon, or if you want, you could even make your own rope with some fabric, which I do show you in one of the later tutorials in this video. So you can definitely check that one out as well. But for this particular bag, I chose to use regular old rope that I found at my hardware store. And the most important thing is making sure that you have enough rope. So the way that I like to make sure I have enough rope is by laying my rope about 4 inches past the bottom of my bag, and then having it go all the way up to the top of my bag, across the top, and then I fold it back down to that bottom edge of my rope, and I'll snip it there. That generally gives me a good amount of rope to go all the way through the upper casing. It's not going to be too short, and then I'll still have enough room to tie a knot without making my rope, again, too short. So you'll cut 2 pieces of rope at the same length. Next, I suggest that you grab a safety pin and just pin it to the end of one of your pieces of rope. If you don't have a safety pin, you could always get some painter's tape and just wrap that around the edge as well. The point is you want to get the rope to have a bit of a stiffer point. That way you can push it through the casing easily enough. You're going to put the rope in on one side of the casing, and then you're actually going to go past the hole on the other side of the casing, back around to the opening where your rope entered. centered. Then pull it on out and you can pull it through your nice little tab before tying it into a knot. Now again, there's actually a few different ways that you can finish your drawstring backpack. So this one in particular, I actually just pulled one rope through that bottom tab and then I tied a knot. But if you check out some of the other tutorials, you will notice that one of the bags, I actually pulled both ropes through the bottom tab and tied it in a knot because I knew my knot was going to be thick enough to hold it in place that way. And another method is actually not having tabs at all, but actually sewing the rope into the backpack itself. So you can check out those drawstring backpack tutorials as well if you want to see the different methods and how I finished the backpacks. But we're not quite done because we have not added our cute little loop onto the top of our backpack, and that will allow us to hang our backpack nicely. To do this, grab that last little piece of fabric that we had prepared and just fold both ends in about 1/4 of an inch and give them a nice little press. And then you can grab your fabric and loop it and press it in place as well if you prefer, but you really don't have to do that if you don't want to. Then lay your loop face down on the inside of the back part of your backpack and pin it in place. You will sew along the bottom as well as along the top, but make sure not to sew over your rope that's in your casing because then that will ruin your backpack. But once you've sewn these two seams, this is how the backpack turns out, and I think it's absolutely adorable, especially for a backpack that has no lining. And if you wanted a lining backpack to be a bit sturdier, you could use a thicker type of fabric, something like a canvas, and then your backpack would be a bit sturdier without needing that lining. Now this backpack does have a lining, but I am cheating a little bit because I'm still only cutting out 2 pieces of fabric. This only works, however, if you're using non-directional fabric. For your lining fabric, you will cut 15 inches by 35 inches. For your outer piece of fabric, you are going to cut that at 15 inches by 30 inches. And then you'll need 2 little pieces of fabric cut at 2 inches by 3 inches, and that will be for your tabs. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to prepare those tabs by taking them to your iron and just pressing them in half, and then pressing both long edges in towards that center fold. Finally, folding it in half one last time and clipping it in place. Then just take it to your sewing machine and sew along both long edges, holding these tabs in place. Next, grab your lining fabric and fold it in half, pinning along both side edges. You will sew a seam along both sides from the top down to the bottom. However, on one side, you'll want to leave about a 4-inch opening. I like marking this opening with 2 different types of pins. That way, when I have it at my sewing machine, it mentally reminds me not to sew across that 4-inch opening. We're going to need that hole later on so that we can actually turn our project right side out. Start with a back stitch and end with a back stitch on both sides. Oh, and you will be sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance along both of these sides. Next, it's time to prepare our outer fabric. So we will fold this piece of fabric in half as well, but then from that bottom fold, we need to measure about 1 inch up on both sides, fold our little tabs in half with their raw edges facing out towards the raw edge of our fabric, and place it in between that fold. Then pin it in nicely and then pin along both sides. Once you've done this, then you can sew, starting with a back stitch and ending with a back stitch, a 1/2 inch seam along both sides. Take the outer fabric and turn that right side out. Next, we want to prepare our lining a little bit further. So what we're going to do is we are going to press our seams open, mark about 5 inches down from that top edge on both of those seams. And then you're going to take it to your sewing machine and you are going to sew a back stitch from the top all the way down to that marking, sew across the bottom of that marking, and then back up to the top edge, finishing with a back stitch as well. You're going to do this on both sides of those seams, this is what stops the fabric from getting pulled out of its casing when the drawstring is actually in the backpack itself. Now it's time to grab that outer piece of fabric and tuck it on inside our lining, matching up those outer seams and pinning them in place, and then pinning around the entire top. Once you've done that, then you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam around that entire top edge. Of course, starting with a back stitch and ending with a back stitch. It's at this point that you'll clip away all 4 corners, making sure not to clip over the seam that you've sewn. Once all 4 corners have been trimmed, then we can turn our entire project right side out. Then you can sew shut the opening that we had left in our lining fabric. Now it's time to tuck that lining into the outer fabric. Now our lining pokes up a bit more than our outer fabric, and that's on purpose because that's going to become our casing. So just push the corners down to the bottom together, and I'll just use some clips on those bottom corners to hold the lining in place while I finish this bag. To make it easier to sew, I do recommend bringing it to your iron and giving that top edge a press. You can even measure the edge around the entire top to make sure that it's all nice and even. Then take it to your sewing machine and sew a seam around the top edge of your outer fabric all the way around. You're going to do a back stitch when you start and when you stop, and that will create your casing. Now, because we didn't actually leave a spot for a loop, you're going to take both of your edges back to your sewing machine, and you're just going to sew a little stitch across that seam on the bottom and on the top. Then you can just get your seam ripper and just open up that little hole between those 2 seams that you've sewn. This creates the hole that you need to be able to add your rope through your casing. Now, I mentioned in the first tutorial, but I'm going to mention again how I like to measure out my rope. So this particular rope, I make sure it's about 4 inches below the bottom of the bag, and then I let the rope go all the way up to the top of the bag, across the top of the bag, and then I fold it back all the way down to the bottom of that piece of rope, and I will cut it there. And then you'll cut 2 pieces of rope the same length. You can do this with ribbon, you can do this with fabric rope that you make yourself. If you want to see the fabric rope that I make, I do have that, I think, in the bag number 3. So you can check out that tutorial when you're done this one. Now it's time to add a safety pin to the end of your rope. You'll insert it inside one of the casings. You'll go all the way across and then back around, and your rope will come out the same hole that you put it into. And then your second piece of rope you will insert in the opposite hole, and you'll do the same thing. You'll go all the way around and back out the same hole that it came in. Then even out your rope, and you can tie it in a few different ways. This particular drawstring bag, I actually put it through my loop because I knew my rope was going to be a thick enough knot that it wouldn't slide through that bottom loop. But if you are using a thinner type of rope, then you would allow only one piece of rope to go through that bottom loop, and then you would tie your knot. You can see that method in the first drawstring tutorial that I did in this video series. All right, you guys, this third drawstring bag is definitely getting fancier. We are going to add some lace along the top edge. I also chose to do 3 different types of fabric. So the outer fabric, I've actually sewn 2 pieces of fabric together. Now you don't have to do this, but if you do omit that, then just remember when you're doing your measurements that there is a 1/2 inch seam allowance where I sewed these 2 pieces of fabric together. So that does add an extra inch to my measurements. I cut out 2 pieces of fabric for the top of my outer fabric, and it measures at 12.5 inches by 15 inches. Then I also cut out 2 pieces for that bottom section at 6 inches by 15 inches. Then when they're sewn together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, they will match up with the lining, and the lining is cut at 18 inches by 15 inches. Then I have enough lace to go around that top edge. This, of course, is an optional step, but it does look pretty cute. So just make sure that it's double the width of your lining. Now, I also wanted to add some fabric rope to this particular tutorial. So I ended up cutting 4 2-inch strips of fabric from selvage to selvage. And then I sewed 2 of those together. This will allow you to have 2 long strips of fabric for your fabric rope. To start, we need to sew our 2 outer pieces of fabric together with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. You'll do this twice, so you will end up with 2 nice outer panels. Then take your 2 outer panels and just press those seams open and grab your long strips of fabric. And I'm going to show you how to finish these long strips of fabric so that both ends are finished nicely, just in case you want to use them in one of the earlier tutorials or the last tutorial. But this particular tutorial, it actually doesn't even need finished edges because we're going to sew them into our project. But I wanted you to know how you could finish these. That way, if you did use them for another one of the drawstring backpacks, it'll work for you. So you'll press that seam open on our long strip of fabric, and then on both ends, you'll actually fold the fabric in about 1/2 inch, and then we will go along our entire edge and fold it in half, pressing all the way down from one end to the other end. And then we will fold both of those outer edges in towards that pressed fold that we just created, and you'll start clipping all the way along that edge. When you take this to your sewing machine, you'll start on that bottom edge, do a little back stitch, sew to the longer edge, turn, and then you'll sew all the way down this long strip of fabric, creating yourself a really nice fabric rope. You'll do this for the other long strip of fabric. This way you'll end up with 2 long ropes. Now it's time to prepare our panels. This will look a little bit different than the previous 2 tutorials in this video. You'll match up those side seams if you did sew 2 separate pieces of fabric together. That way you're making sure everything is lined up nicely, but you're actually only going to sew from the top of this panel down past that seam by about 1 inch, and then you're going to stop and just stop with a back stitch. So you're going to do back stitch at the top all the way down past that seam, and then back stitch right past that seam. Leave the entire bottom open. Then on your lining fabric, you are going to sew all the way from the top down to the bottom and across a little bit, but you will want to make sure that you leave a 4-inch opening at the bottom of your lining. This is very important. So you'll do a back stitch at the top, go all the way down to that bottom corner, and then go across about 3 inches in, stop doing a back stitch there as well, and do that on both sides of the lining. All of these seams are done with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then to prepare our seams to become casings, you will once again mark from that top edge down around 5 inches on both seams on the outer panels as well as both seams on the lining. You'll sew down one edge, sew across that marked line, and then sew back up the other edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch. And of course, you'll want to clip away the 2 bottom corners of your lining fabric, making sure not to clip away the previous seam that you just sewed. Now take your outer panel and turn it right side out. At this point, if you're adding lace, you will want to attach the lace to the top portion of our outer fabric. Just pin it all the way around. Also made sure that the ends of my lace were overlapping each other by about 1 inch. Once everything was pinned in place, I took this to the sewing machine and I sewed around that top edge using around 1/4 inch seam allowance. And of course, make sure you backstitch when you start and when you stop. Now it's time to tuck our outer fabric into our lining fabric and just match up those side seams and clip all the way around the top, making sure, of course, that the lace is nicely tucked in between those 2 layers. Then take this back to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance around that top edge, backstitching when you start and when you stop. And now it's time to turn your bag right side out. I know things seem a little strange with this particular tutorial, but trust me, there is a reason why we are keeping that outer lining open. We are going to be sewing our fabric straps into our outer lining instead of adding loops. So now that you've turned this right side out, bring it to your iron and just give that top edge a quick press, but be mindful of the type of lace that you've chosen because some lace can melt under different heat in your iron. So just make sure that you're using a low heat and press that top edge. For this step, you'll need to use a water-soluble pencil, or for myself, I like to use my friction pen, which disappears with the heat of my iron. And you will mark 1 inch down from the top edge, and then 2 inches down from the top edge, or 1 inch down from the last line that you drew. Once you've done this on both sides, then we can take it over to our sewing machine and we are going to sew 3 seams. You're going to sew around both of the lines that you just marked, as well as along our top edge, because that will just hold the lace up nicely. Now that all 3 of those seams have been sewn, you can press away your marking if you used a friction pen. And now it is time to grab a seam ripper because we are going to create 2 holes for our casing. Between the 2 bottom seams, there's about a 1 inch space, and you can unpick that space. If you want to, you can reinforce that seam first by just putting a little stitch across the top and a little stitch across the bottom before unpicking if you would like. I do like to do this because I like to make sure things are secure. Once you have seam ripped those holes, one on either side of our casing, then you can grab a pin and just pin it through the bottom of one of your fabric ropes that you created, and we will add it to our bag the same way that we have done the last 2 tutorials. So you will wiggle that fabric on through the one opening all the way around past the second opening and back through the hole that you started with. You will then add your second rope through the opposite hole and of course back around, exiting out the same side. Then even out your rope, and because we are actually going to attach our rope into the bag itself, you can trim your rope to the length of your bag. So that's why I said you did not have to finish the ends of your rope for this particular drawstring bag, but if you were going to make fabric rope for any of the other 3 bags in this tutorial set, then you would definitely want to finish those edges. So just lay those strips down and trim them so that they are the same length as our bag. Take your outer fabric and just turn it so that it is right side facing in once again. Reach on in and straighten out your fabric rope. You really don't want your fabric rope to end up twisted. Make sure that they are 2 on the right and 2 on the left, the correct 2. And then you're just going to tuck them out the side of our bag about 1 inch up from the bottom and then pin them in place. Now all we have to do is finish sewing this bottom. So you are going to sew a 1/4 inch seam starting from where your seam left off, or you could start like 1 inch up from that. Do a little back stitch and then go all the way down to the corner. And actually as you're going over your fabric strap, go backwards and then forwards again. The reason why I do this is just to reinforce that strap. Then go along the bottom and back up and over that strap, reinforcing it, going all the way up to the top edge where you can end with a back stitch. Next, clip away the bottom corners of that outer lining, and you can clip away any extra fabric rope that is there as well before turning your project right side out. The way that you'll do that is reaching through the bottom of that lining. Now, if you did forget to leave a hole there, just unpick it. It's not the end of the world. We'll be able to fix it. Turn the entire project right side out and then give it a quick press along that opening before sewing your lining shut. And this is the end result. I think it is the cutest drawstring bag of the 3, and that fabric rope, I have to say, it's my favorite. And on to our final drawstring bag. This one is a fun one because of those boxed bottoms and that pocket. My son loves this one. He has already snagged it for his own. You will cut 2 pieces of fabric at 18 inches by 15 inches for your outer fabric, and then another 2 pieces of fabric at 18 inches by 15 inches inches for your lining fabric. We are also going to be using a third piece of fabric, and that piece of fabric is going to be for our casing. You will cut 2 at 15 inches by 3 inches, and then one more little strip will be cut at 2 inches by 12 inches. And finally, if you are going to be adding a pocket on the inside of your bag, you will cut that at 6 inches wide by 9 inches tall. You really can change that measurement to whatever you want. Just remember that the top of that pocket is going to get folded down by about an inch. Just keep that in mind when you're doing your math. We are going to create a boxed bottom for this particular bag. So what you'll do is you'll lay your fabric on top of each other, and then you will mark a 1.5 inch square on both bottom corners. So you'll do that on the outer fabric and on the lining fabric. Then just trim away the 2 bottom corners. So all 4 pieces of fabric will have a 1.5 inch square removed from the bottom corners of those pieces of fabric. Next, it's time to prepare our pocket. So take your pocket on over to your iron, and you will be pressing your edges underneath. Starting on the bottom and then on the sides, just fold the fabric in about 1/4 inch and then press it in place. And then on the top, you will fold that down 1/2 inch, give it a press, and then fold it down a second 1/2 inch. So you'll lose about an inch worth of that fabric, pressing it in place as well. Then take that to your sewing machine and sew along that top edge of your pocket. Then you can set that aside. Next, it's time to prepare our casings. So take your 2 pieces of fabric that were cut at 3 inches by 15 inches, and you are going to fold the ends in at around 3/4 inch on both short sides. Then you will sew those folds in place, starting with a back stitch, sewing along that inner edge and ending with a back stitch. You will do that for all 4 edges. Now I just want to show you here that you should measure your casings to make sure that they are not longer than 14 inches when you are done. It's very important that they don't end up too long, because then they won't fit in nicely into our bag. Now we will fold these casings wrong sides together and just press them in half. Now let's prepare our third strip of fabric. This one is the one that was 2 inches by 12 inches, and you'll just fold it in half, give it a press, and then you'll fold both outer edges in towards that center seam that we just pressed, then fold it in half again and clip along that edge. You'll then take this to the sewing machine and you will sew a seam along both long edges. You really don't need to worry about back stitching with this step. Once you've sewn along this strip, then you will cut it down into 3 pieces. You will need 1 piece that is 6 inches long, and then 2 more pieces that are 3 inches long each. Now it's time to attach our pocket. So grab 1 piece of lining fabric and center your pocket on your lining fabric. Remember, our casing is going to be added along the top of this fabric, so you don't really need to worry about having it too low, because our casing is not going to be made from that top edge. So just pin your pocket in place. Now I did use a little bit of glue here because I found it actually easier for me than pinning those corners down. You can do that if you wish, but it's not necessary. And then sew along all 3 edges, remembering of course to backstitch when you start and when you stop. Now that the pocket is attached, grab the second half of your lining and lay it right sides together on top. You will then pin along both sides and the bottom. Then when you sew this all together, you are going to sew the bottom shut. You will sew both sides, except you will leave a 4-inch opening on one of the sides. Start and stop with a back stitch for all 3 sides. And also, please note those 2 little squares that we cut out on the bottom, you are not going to sew them shut in this step. You will be using a 1/2-inch seam allowance for this process. Now it's time to box both corners. So the way that you'll do this is you will line up your seams, and then you will clip along that bottom edge, and you will sew a 1/2-inch seam closing up both of those bottom corners. This will create your boxed corner. As you can see here, our lining is all nice and boxed up. So now you can take this to an iron and just press those seams open. Next, we are going to prepare our outer fabric. So the way that we'll do this is we will measure up 1 inch from the bottom of our outer fabric, from that bottom square. You'll fold one of your 3-inch pieces of fabric in half and line up the raw edge of that little strip to the raw edge of your drawstring. You'll do this on both sides. Then grab the second piece of your outer fabric, lay it right sides together, and then pin along all 3 edges, so both sides and the bottom. Then when you are sewing this together, you don't need to leave a 4-inch opening, but you do need to leave those little boxed corners unsewn. So you'll start at the top, you'll do a little back stitch, and you'll sew all the way down, and then when you're going over the little loop, you'll go past it, and then back, and then past it again before stopping with a back stitch. You'll sew across the bottom and then do the same thing along the other side. You will do all of this with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. And then just like you did with the lining, we are going to box our corners by matching up those seams and then sewing across with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Once again, you can press those seams open and then take your outer fabric and turn it right side out. Now it's time to add your outer casings to your outer fabric. So you will line the raw edges up along with the raw edges of your outer fabric, and you will pin it all the way across. You'll make sure that it's centered so that they line up the same on both sides. And then you'll also want to take that little loop that we cut out earlier at 6 inches, fold it in half, and also tuck it underneath one of your casings. Then you'll attach your casings using a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and of course, back stitching when you start and when you stop. And if you want to reinforce that loop, then once again, just sew over it and then go backwards and then sew over it again before you continue on with your seam. Now that you've attached your casing, make sure that when you are tucking the outer fabric into the inner lining, that the loop and the pocket are on the same side. Generally speaking, I like to have the pocket up against the back when the backpack is worn, and the loop, of course, you want on that side as well, because when you hang it up, that's generally where it looks its nicest. So make sure they're on the same sides, and then line up those side seams, pin around the entire top, and sew a 1/2-inch seam allowance all the way around. Of course, starting with a back stitch and stopping with a back stitch. Now it's time to turn our project right side out by reaching through that little hole we left in our lining, pulling the entire thing on out, and then just press along that lining hole to line it up nicely. You can pin across that top and then just sew along that edge to close that hole in. Now it's time to tuck the lining into our drawstring bag, and then you'll take it on over to your iron and just press that top edge so that it's nicely smoothed out before sewing another seam around that top edge. That seam will just hold everything nicely into place. And like I've said before, what do? You do a back stitch when you start and when you stop. I love that this bag has that boxed bottom, and now we are ready to add our rope. So once again, measure your rope about 4 inches from the bottom of your bag, then up to the top, across the top, and back on over and down. You will cut your rope at the bottom of that edge, and then you will cut a second rope to match. And as we did on all 3 previous drawstring backpacks, you'll grab yourself a pin and you'll pull your rope on through one side of that casing and around to the other side so that both of your strings are facing in the same direction. You'll tuck them through that bottom loop and tie a knot. Then that second rope, you will start on the opposite side and you will pull it on through back towards the side that it came through, back down through that loop once again, and tie a second knot. And there you go. You have a beautiful drawstring bag with an awesome additional casing in a 3rd fabric. You've added a pocket, you've got boxed bottoms. It's just super cute and I love it so much. Oh, and don't forget, you even have that nice hook to hang your backpack up. I hope that you guys have a wonderful day. Enjoy sewing, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.